The Australian Financial Review.
The question of whether it's better to educate boys and girls separately has been debated for centuries. Advocates of single-sex schools argue boys and girls learn differently, while those who support coeducation say it reflects the real world. In recent decades, the real-world argument appeared to be winning as more schools opted to go co-ed. But something happened last year in Sydney. After an elite boys' school announced its decision to start accepting girls, the response was extreme.
Students at Newington College are greeted by protesters outside their school grounds. Dozens of parents and former students standing together in a silent demonstration, calling out a decision to turn the boys' school co-ed.
At the protest, one of the parents carried a placard that said, "Boys will become second-class citizens in their own school." Another protester, an old boy, broke down in tears.
Well, I'm an old boy at the school, and my son is also an old boy. And the intention was always that I'd have a grandson, but I won't bring him to a co-ed school.
Personally, I think we will look back on what is happening now with real interest in decades to come. As we look back at some of those debates from the 19th and late 20th century and think how this perfectly sums up a cultural, ideological and political moment rather than seeing it purely in educational context.
Welcome to The Fin. I'm Lisa Murray. Today, AFR Magazine contributor Brook Turner on the backlash against turning boys' schools co-ed, why Sydney has become the epicentre of that battle, and whether there is still a place in Australia for single-sex schools. It's Thursday, February 13.
Today's episode of The Fin is brought to you by IG. IG is Australia's #1 CFD and FX provider, offering over 17,000 markets from domestic shares to international commodities, all on one platform. With competitive spreads and lightning-fast execution, trade the opportunities you hear with IG. To find out more, visit IG.com. CFDs are high-risk products. Refer to our PDS and TMD on our website. #1 in Australia by primary relationships, CFDs and FX. Investment trends November 2023. Leverage trading report. IG Australia Proprietary Limited. AFSL 515106.
Hi Brooke, thanks for coming on the podcast.
Pleasure.
Coeducation in Australia has become a real hot-button issue, but most students actually attend co-ed schools. Single-sex schools aren't very common. So if this affects a relatively small group of people, how has it come to be such a big issue?
The context of this is really very interesting. About 93% of students attend co-ed schools and really only about 7% attend single-sex schools. And single-sex is a particularly late 19th century best practice or ideal. In Australia, it has a really interesting history. We're a bit of an outlier in terms of single-sex. We have a lot more single-sex schools. And they tend to be in New South Wales. So the historical reason for that is that New South Wales pretty well alone had the population to sustain single-sex in the public system. In other states, schools tended to have to be co-ed by force of numbers, which is why 50% of all single-sex schools are in New South Wales and about 75% of single-sex public schools. Of those, about 85% are private, mostly Catholic, and then there are the big expensive private schools, mostly in Sydney, that for obvious reasons, given the people involved, get a lot of the attention. The other really interesting thing by way of background is that debates about competing benefits of single-sex and co-education are anything but new. They've really been playing out for decades in Australia, and they've tended to have almost a quasi-party political tinge. So in the early 70s, the Whitlam government school commission focused on equality of opportunity for girls. And almost as night follows day, by the 90s, you had major public debates about boys falling behind in education, in part as a result which culminated in the 2002 Howard-era inquiry into boys' education. So, equally interestingly, the expert consensus seems to be, this is highly contested, I have to say, that there's no conclusive evidence of advantages of single-sex education for either gender. Yes, single-sex schools often and usually do better in exams and ATARs and things like that, but you can never control for the socioeconomic factors like resourcing and privilege. So it's really hard. There's a lot of studies out there. You can get something to support a position, but there's nothing that's taken to be conclusive by the experts. But many of the experts consider that coeducation would inevitably prevail over time as the dominant education model in the way that single sex had a century or so earlier.
It was a natural progression.
Absolutely, that it was kind of inevitable. And you had big schools in the UK with centuries of tradition, like rugby, which were transitioning to coeducation from the mid-70s. And locally, schools like Barker followed that lead for the same reasons we'd followed the 19th century lead. It was the times. That brings us up to Newington, which announced in November 2023 that it will phase in coeducation. Now, if the legal challenges fail, this year, 2025, will be Newington's last year as a boys-only establishment. And from January next year, girls go to kindergarten in year 5 and then years 7 and 11 in 2028. And then I think by 2033, it's all co-educational. And the scale and the persistence of the reaction has really been a shock to everyone.
So let's talk about what's happening at Newington, which prompted you to write the cover story for the February issue of the AFR Magazine. Why has that school's decision to go co-ed had such a dramatic response?
Well, that's exactly what we wanted to find out, I guess. Why a decision that many saw as logical and even inevitable, given changing social and education models, and the way those models have tended to reflect the ideals of societies over the years, became suddenly so controversial. Newington's a particularly interesting case because it charges about $45,000 a year, and it was founded by the Uniting Church 162 years ago. And the Uniting Church is really a character in this. It's a liberal, ecumenical, progressive church. Both it and the school have a really strong history of socioeconomic and cultural diversity, which I don't know whether this was conscious at the time or whether it just arose over time, but it's really reinforced by Newington's quite unique location in Stanmore, it's the inner west for those who not in Sydney. Because it's on a kind of transport hub, it draws from the south and the north and the east, and it really is almost unparalleled amongst those elite schools in the way it draws from all parts of Sydney.
So it's diverse by geography.
It's diverse by geography, absolutely, and that's been a really strong value of the school and the church throughout. The interesting thing about this, and it's often forgotten in the current debate, is where this started. And it started quite some time ago. It was early, I think it was about February 2022, when Newington announced it would look at 3 areas to make sure it was keeping up with the times. I mean, it's a kind of classic statement by a school, especially a school like that. The 3 areas were how to ensure diversity in a rapidly gentrifying area, whether the school should move towards co-educational, and that was kind of a little bit of a thing that was happening at the time. I think Cranbrook was around the same time.
Which is another Sydney school.
Another Sydney school, by sheer nature of its geography, more elite. And also how big the school should become given that growing population. So almost that how you balance pastoral care and individual care, which is, I think, once again, a strong value of theirs, with the fact that there's like the prognosis that over 40,000 kids were going to be coming into the area. So how do you also cater to your catchment, your immediate catchment as well? So as a result of that decision to look at those areas, they looked at studies, they did their own qualitative and quantitative research, and then did over 40 consultation sessions with current and past students and parents. And then in November 2023, they announced that they would transition to co-education, and really all hell broke loose.
Well, the backlash against a prestigious Sydney school has intensified over its decision to become fully co-educational by 2033.
Totally distraught by this catastrophic decision.
It's all part of this sort of woke, toxic masculinity type palaver.
The opposition's been unprecedented in its scale, vehemence, persistence, and while there were earlier debates, this one really became something extra.
Parents and old boys picketed Newington College, rallying against the school's decision to start admitting girls.
I've spoken to lots of families and they've basically been sold a lie.
The process which led to this decision was a sham, based purely on ideology, a woke ideology.
Wherever this opposition could be crystallised and made real, there have been really concerted efforts to make that happen.
Brook, this is now playing out in the courts. There's a Supreme Court action. There's also a potential federal court case. So this fight is ongoing.
Yes.
You spoke to a lot of people for the story, including parents and former students. What are the main arguments for and against the school going co-ed?
Many of the anti-coeducational forces say that there's no practical reason for Newington to go coeducational. This is really deeply an ideological idea. And most fundamentally, you will often hear from anti-co-ed parents and alumni that the education they had was good for them, provided them with a good life, provided them with a good education that allowed them in turn to send their children to good schools. Ain't broke, why fix it? Mm-hmm. Fundamentally, that is it. There are no practical reasons. There's also a lack, increasingly as coeducation has begun to prevail, a lack of single-sex education for boys particularly. Girls' schools don't tend to go coeducational. Boys' schools do. So on that basis, they've paid for a single-sex male education and suddenly things are changing on them and they feel that they've been taken for a ride, as a number of people expressed to me. On the other side, the arguments are quite simple. It's 2025, so it's the end of the first quarter of the 21st century. Why are we educating boys separately, particularly when 80% of the world's schools, apparently, are coeducational? So why is Australia an outlier here? A lot of people speak from their own experience again. Some of these highly reflective individuals that I've spoken to have reflected on their own education at Newington. And I mean, they're the head of rowing, or the deputy head of rowing, the deputy head prefect of the school. And they don't feel it fitted them for what came next. So while they really appreciated the education, really appreciated the school, they really felt it could be better. One of the key people we spoke to was Ian Webster, a former Newington student who sent his sons to Newington and was on the council of Newington and has become the spokesman for the Save Newington College group. He typifies this argument in saying there's no practical reason for Newington going co-ed, that it is a purely ideological move.
We have asked since this was mooted nearly 3 years ago, why? Why do this? Give us a reason. We're open-minded. Give us a reason. Why are you doing this? Oh, no response, other than those ideological reasons that I discussed earlier.
Another key argument here is that going co-educational is really going to cost too much money, that there's no evidence that it's better for students. There are very healthy waiting lists already for Newington, so why would you rob families of the choice of a single-sex education in the area?
There's far more girls-only single-sex schools than boys-only. So why should the choice available to families who want a single-sex education for their boys be so impeded? It defies logic.
And Ian's very motivated to keep fighting against the change.
These are not factors that you can just gloss over or brush aside. They are serious and large. And to do it on what amounts to an ideological whim brought by a small number of people is a scandalous abuse of power.
So on the other side, we also spoke to a lot of people in favour of the move.
So my name's Casper. I'm a marketing consultant, I suppose, is the easiest way to describe it. And I've got a 16-year-old and a 12-year-old in Newington.
So Casper was quite shocked when he went along to a consultation evening in 2022 as part of this 40 sessions. As an icebreaker, a facilitator asked what they liked about the school. And of course, everyone was saying it's diversity, it's inclusivity. But then the facilitator started discussing whether the school at some point in the future should accept girls, and the response was highly unexpected.
And there was a complete reversal. I remember someone banged the table. There were a couple of people in the room who were just, over my dead body. The moment you do that, the moment you let girls into the school, I'll pull my boys out. There was one fellow who said, there'll be no bequest from me. He was obviously a very wealthy man. And I was astonished. A moment before we'd be talking about diversity and inclusiveness. and respecting individual children. But the idea of girls in the school they used to go to, absolutely unacceptable. It was quite extraordinary.
And what's interesting about Casper is he describes himself as a small c conservative economically and in terms of his general outlook. But he definitely dismisses the idea that Newington's move to coeducation was part of a woke agenda.
I certainly am not a left-wing warrior.
And he goes on to make the case for the argument that the single-sex school ideal is outdated.
The tradition of educating boys and girls separately comes from a pretty toxic root in the 18th and 19th century, that women were regarded as intellectually inferior, not worth educating. It was regarded as a waste of money because they would not go on to work, they would go on to marry and have children. So the tradition of educating men and women separately, I think, has extremely toxic roots, and it's time we all moved on.
So Casper's gone from someone who didn't think it was a big deal at all for his son's school to move to coeducation to now believing it's actually really important. I think he kind of typifies a lot of people there. And this debate's very much playing out at other schools as well. And one that went slightly ahead of Newington and also had really major repercussions was Cranbrook in Sydney's eastern suburbs.
So, Brooke, let's talk about Cranbrook, because at the same time the issue blew up at Newington, we also saw it divide stakeholders at Cranbrook. That included a messy and public brawl on the school council involving some big names in the business world, some big names in the Financial Review. What happened there?
So Cranbrook's a very particular place. It sits right on Rose Bay. It's got this incredible kind of bulwark down onto the harbour. And it is a real bastion of privilege. It's a very particular school. It has a really rich tradition. I think, everyone from Barry Humphries to James Packer's gone to that school. It's a bit of a jewel in the crown of elite Sydney. And what really happened over time, there was major division within the council and between some of those progressive forces, like Scott Farquhar, the Atlassian founder, was one of the people who supported this. There weren't things like pickets, there weren't some of the more public aspects, but the headmaster prevailed, and yet he was gone shortly thereafter in 2024 when there was a Four Corners program on an alleged culture of toxic masculinity at the school. It really did feel like there was a camel and a straw there, and the headmaster did, in the end, fall on his sword for that.
Mm.
So what's interesting about Newington and Cranbrook and those two debates is, one, Cranbrook went slightly earlier and, in a sense, front-loaded the Newington debate. And what's interesting about this whole debate is how you can see it in two ways. And for many, Cranbrook was an ice-breaking precedent in a way. It started that process. Newington was in the slipstream. But for others, Cranbrook would very much have been a cautionary tale. What was really interesting about doing the Newington story was I really tried to dive into both sides as deeply as I could and understand those arguments. And wrote the piece, and then towards the end, Newington actually decided to speak to us, or at least speak to us in terms of written replies to questions, which was a first. They'd been very careful to maintain a dignified silence because there was nothing to win there. I mean, you were going to alienate someone on one side or the other. So what was interesting was when the ka-ching moment happened and I asked them how many boys had been removed from the school, and you can never quite tell exactly why a student's been removed, but they said somewhere between 50 and 60. But at the same time, 1,000 girls had applied for enrolment, which is a really interesting potential vote of confidence. That doesn't mean 1,000 girls have enrolled, but it's a really strong endorsement of something else that's prevailing in this argument, which is those who are thinking about the future are quite strongly co-ed. Those who've got kids who are looking at going to school in 5-10 years are much more positive about coeducation.
Today's episode of The Fin is brought to you by IG. IG is Australia's #1 CFD and FX provider, offering over 17,000 markets from domestic shares to international commodities, all on one platform. With competitive spreads and lightning-fast execution, trade the opportunities you hear with IG. To find out more, visit IG.com. CFDs are high-risk products. Refer to our PDS and TMD on our website. #1 in Australia by primary relationships, CFDs and FX. Investment trends November 2023. Leverage trading report. IG Australia Proprietary Limited. AFSL 515106.
We're talking about the coeducation debate in Australia and why it's been such a divisive issue. Brook, you just mentioned that at Newington, where there's a very vocal opposition to that school's move to go co-ed, that already 1,000 girls have applied for enrolment and only 50 to 60 boys have been withdrawn. Does that suggest people are coming around to the idea that coeducation is better for students? What do the experts say?
Many of the experts agree that, as we mentioned previously, there's no conclusive evidence one way or another for the benefits of single-sex education.
The argument for coeducation tends to be social and the argument for single-sex schooling tends to be academic. But there's no really robust evidence that says that one or the other produce better rounded people or better academic results.
So one of the really interesting people I spoke to was Professor Helen Proctor at Sydney University, who's also an historian and did her PhD on the history of coeducation in Australia.
I've been surprised by the intensity of the debates around Newington and coeducation, and I've been quite surprised that a move for a school to go coeducational has been interpreted as a kind of woke agenda. And so I think that that's very current, and I don't think that's something that you would have seen 10, 20, 30 years ago.
And Helen reminded us that Australia is a bit of an outlier in terms of adherence to single-sex schooling, and that's partly because of the number of people who send their kids to private schools.
Also, Australia is unusual internationally in our strong public subsidies for private schools. So if you want to send your kid to Eton, I mean, it'd be the cost of a professional salary every year. So it's extraordinarily expensive, and there's a very small percentage in England of people that can do that. So the percentages are higher of private schooling in Australia and have been certainly since the 1980s. So school choice is a phenomenon in which Australia is a bit of an exception, internationally unusual.
And once again, she pointed to factors such as socioeconomic circumstances as the really key driver of academic success.
When you look at those HSC results, that's the confounding variable, the social class and the history of the school. But certainly co-ed and single sex, it's not the key variable at all. I would say it probably ranks nowhere on the top 100 variables of where the results come from.
Brook, as Helen says, Australia has a higher percentage of students going to private schools than other countries. Why is that? Why are parents, particularly in Sydney, so committed to educating privileged boys and girls separately?
So in my lifetime, I remember that moment when the subsidy for private schools increased. It became more of a choice. It became an easier choice for parents. It's also a thing about the kind of environment we have, the level of competition for jobs, all of those sorts of things. I mean, it's incredibly difficult for young people now. We all know that. Almost every news headline is about the comparative disadvantage of younger people. And I think if you have young children, you see them growing up into that sort of context. So, of course, you want to give them every possible advantage.
It's very aspirational, isn't it? Wanting to put all your income into the education of your child. It's not just a sort of wealthy person's endeavour now. I think most people would like their children to have some sort of advantage if they think there is an advantage there.
And we're a relatively recently settled migrant country. So, of course, that aspiration is incredibly important in Australia. It's one of our key defining characteristics, and that plays out in the school realm as well, particularly given the way we subsidise private education. So Interestingly, I mean, when you look at the kind of support that went to private schools under the Howard government, and that I think is really when there was a major shift. It was part of the party politicisation of public and private education. It's part of that kind of overall, almost ideological underpinning of various educational trends over the decades.
Andrew Tate, the controversial influencer, is a name that often gets brought up in this debate. Some parents argue that coeducation is a way to steer boys away from Tate's misogyny, while others say forcing a school to go co-ed is just the thing that will send young men into Tate's arms. How much are the anxieties about gender a part of this debate?
They are absolutely fundamental. To me, as an observer who's written about this, they really fundamentally underpin this. It's really interesting that in this same period of time, Trump's major attack ad in the US, the one they spent the most money on, was something like "She is for they, them," talking about Kamala Harris, and "I am for you." And that really got incredible traction, paid traction. I mean, it was all over the place at the time. And it really made me think about even the words used in terms of describing what Newington was doing or what Cranbrook was doing, that they were transitioning to coeducation. It had this kind of particular ideological echo at the time. And at a time when the future seemed so fraught and fluid, a word like transitioning almost became subconsciously triggering in some way. And what is so interesting about that is a lot of the education debates over the years, we have followed the English lead. I mean, that move to single-sex education in the 19th century was very much after a headmaster had been over to England and seen what was happening there. Same thing happened. The headmaster of Barker in the 1970s went to England and saw the co-ed moves at schools like Rugby and started that process here. So we've had that real English lead. And what I think is interesting about this debate is the way a more direct American echo was particularly heard in the Newington debate, I think. And Tate was very much the spider at the centre of this really interesting web. And what was fascinating about it was, as you say, both sides could cite him. And that was true of so many facts in this debate. They could be cited by either side with equal conviction. It just depended on your viewpoint. And one of the things that Helen Proctor said about studies too is this is a choose-your-own-adventure experience where you can actually find a study to support you, but your ideology is actually the starting point.
Finally, Brooke, what do you think will happen at Newington, where this story started for you? And do you think this is the end of single-sex schools in Australia?
I think with Newington, I mean, obviously I'm just an observer, but in terms of the co-education move at Newington, I think we're not so much at half time in this fight as three-quarter time, and we seem to be moving into that kind of end game, and we'll see that play out over the coming months. I don't have any doubt that those transitions will take place as planned. They're imminent now. A ship like that is so enormous that it takes a while to turn round, as we've seen, but once it does turn round, it becomes inevitable. I don't personally think it'll be the end of single-sex schools in Australia. There's been an uptick recently in New South Wales in enrolments at single-sex boys' schools. I think girls' schools already had that uptick. So obviously, and maybe for some of these reasons, this is something that at least for the foreseeable future is going to continue. Personally, I think we will look back on what is happening now with real interest in decades to come. As we look back at some of those debates from the 19th and late 20th century and think how this perfectly sums up a cultural, ideological and political moment rather than seeing it purely in an educational context. I think that is what is interesting about now. Education, because it's about people's children, which is to say the things that are most precious to them, almost their future selves, become perfect reflections of their own values, their own experiences. And the way that is playing out globally now in terms of gender and anxiety about the future is fascinating. I think it's fascinating the way that's been particularly visited on schools in recent years.
Thanks for coming on the podcast, Brooke.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for listening to The Fin. I'm Lisa Murray, with Brook Turner reporting today. The Fin is produced by Alex Gow, Martin Peralta and Lap Fan. Fiona Buffini is the executive producer. Our theme is by Alex Gow. If you like the show and want to hear more, follow us wherever you get your podcasts and consider rating and reviewing us as it helps others find us. For more stories about markets, business and power, subscribe to The Financial Review at afr.com/subscribe. See you next week.
The Australian Financial Review.
Today's episode of The Fin was brought to you by IG. IG is Australia's #1 CFD and FX provider, offering over 17,000 markets from domestic shares to international commodities, all on one platform. Visit IG.com. CFDs are high-risk products. Refer to our PDS and TMD on our website. #1 in Australia by primary relationships, CFDs and FX. Investment Trends November 2023. Leverage Trading Report. IG Australia Proprietary Limited. AFSL 515106.